D&D 5e has been out for 8 years now, and throughout those 8 years we've gotten a lot of published adventures, and then of course also a lot of villains. Some of these villains have been very fun and entertaining, some of these villains have been, well, less so, and in this video I just want to give you my ranking, my tier list of the 5e Dungeons & Dragons villains. I'm going to take a holistic approach to things, so I'll try and look at both at how the villain interacts with the adventurers and the adventure, the story, how it comes to life as a villain, what is its motivations, what do the characters know, and then of course also the mechanical aspect of the villain. How are the characters going to face it? Is it going to be a fun battle, a fun final encounter? As is always the case with lists like these, it is of course very subjective. You are allowed to disagree with me, and I would love to hear why you agree or disagree with me in the comments down below. And while you're down there, you can also like the video and subscribe to the channel. That stuff really helps us out a lot. So the first villain we're going to look at is from Tomb of Annihilation, and it is Acererak. Acererak is a lich with an altered spell list. He also has some extra abilities he can use. He has a Staff of the Forgotten One, a Talisman of the Sphere, and a Sphere of Annihilation. As for how he is involved in the adventure, he shows up at the very end. He's not foreshadowed a whole lot, if memory serves. And then when they defeat the Atropol at the end of Acererak's dungeon, then he shows up and confronts them, and they have this final battle with him. So story-wise, I don't think he's particularly strong or involved in the story, but he does have a quite interesting stat block, since he is a lich, and even a lich with just a bit more juice to it, with better spell selection, I feel, and also some additional actions that an ordinary lich can't take. For these reasons, I think that Acererak is a good, probably C-tier villain, right there in the middle of the pack. Nothing too impressive, but still good enough, I'd say. And the next villain we're going to take a look at is from Call of the Netherdeep, and it is Alexian, who is this sort of demigod-like Herculean creature character who the characters are meant to save, but then will also have to fight at the end. He's very tied into the story. You'll hear mention of him, you'll see visions of him, you're sort of following in his footsteps. So there's a lot of build up to Alexian, and then you fight him in 3 different forms, which I also think is fun, where he has different abilities, he has cool lair actions, he has dynamic battlefield actions, and there's just that build up throughout and also in that final encounter. And for me, I think that Alexian, while probably not fitting the bill of a villain of sorts, he is somewhere up here in the A or S tier, and I think I am actually gonna put him in the S tier. I don't think you can expect much more from a villain. Alright, next up we're gonna dive into the villains from Waterdeep Dragon Heist, because there are in Waterdeep Dragon Heist, of course, 4 separate villains you can end up facing, and it is the Casalantas, it is Manchun, and it is Jarl Axel Baenre, and it is of course the Xanathar. Now my main issue with the villains of Waterdeep Dragon Heist is that there are 4 villains, and that means you have less time to build up each villain. So once you've chosen which of these 4 different characters are going to be your villain, then there's not as much put into the adventure to make that villain really stand out and make them involved in the story, if that makes sense. So for me, that's a sort of a weakness. It's the trade-off you make when you have different villains for an adventure, and it also hurts each of these villains as they don't really come to life that much throughout the story. Another weak point of these villains is that you're unlikely to actually face them in combat at the end. Most of them are too powerful for you to face, and some of them simply won't show up as the adventure is written. Now you can do a lot to make sure that they do show up. It's something we have done a lot for in our DM's guide for Waterdeep Dragon Heist, to sort of make sure that you can get that showdown with the villain. So if we judge the villains for how they are described in the adventure, I unfortunately think that the Casalantas are gonna go down here, because while they have the coolest motivation, they have very lackluster stat blocks, and they aren't really that involved in the adventure. You're not going to hear a whole lot about them. Manchun is a better villain from a stat block perspective. Only appearance is as a simulacrum, which of course is less interesting if you do end up fighting him in the end. And he is really not that involved in the story at all, as it is written. So just because he's more mechanically entertaining than these 2 Casalantas, I put him up here D, but it's still down near the bottom. Jarlaxle is a fun character. We had a lot of fun with him when one of the times I ran through Waterdeep Dragon Heist, because he's just, yes, a very fun character, and as a villain he's awesome because he's not really a villain, he's not out to kill the characters or anything, but he is still very much in it for himself. That being said, you're not actually going to fight Jarlaxle, and Jarlaxle is, if you do fight him, actually not that interesting, which is sort of sad because he should be very interesting and fun, just like his persona is, but his stat block is not that dynamic when you actually get down into martial one-on-one combat. For this reason, he also ends up in the D tier. I really want to put him higher because I think his personality stuff, the way he could be involved in adventure is good, but that means you have to do a lot of work. So if you're not doing that, he is down here at the D tier. The Xanathar is just for being a beholder gonna go up here in the C tier. Beholders are awesome, and Mad Beholders are also awesome, and Xanathar is gonna feature heavily in the adventures written, or more heavily probably than each of the other villains, simply because the Xanathar guild is such a big presence in Waterdeep. Next up, we're gonna take a look at Waterdeep Dungeon of the Mad Mage, where the villain is, of course, Halaster Blackcloak, this very mad mage that they're gonna meet at the end. Now there is some foreshadowing for Halaster Blackcloak. It's obviously his dungeon. The characters would have been going through for something like the 900 sessions if you're actually playing through everything in Dungeon of the Mad Mage. He is also a character who has a very dangerous spell list and does a lot of spell casting. So I think that makes for an interesting villain all told. I think that Halaster Blackcloak is a decent B tier villain. Moving on, we have the villain from Rime of the Frostmaiden, and that is of course Auril the Frostmaiden. My issue with Auril the Frostmaiden in that adventure is that she's not built up particularly much as written. If the adventure is played as it is written throughout, you do have some run-ins with her minions, of course, but there is a lot you can do to sort of build her more up. It's something that I've done very in-depth, both articles, videos, and our guide, of course, on the DM's Guild, to sort of ensure that you can build up Auril and make her a more compelling villain. Another issue I have with Auril is that the characters have two opportunities to face her in the adventure as it is written, and the first time they have an opportunity to face her, she is probably too strong for them, and the second time they will face her, or they will have an opportunity to face her, she's probably a bit too weak for them. In addition, her stat block is not that compelling, even though it has these 3 different forms, and that's always fun. The 3 different forms aren't really that interesting. So for those reasons, I think that as written, Auril is probably a C tier villain. But I would say that there's a lot of potential for her to become an A or even S tier villain if you just make some changes to how she plays in the adventure, and of course also some change to her stat block, and it is something we've done a lot for, so if you're interested in that, there will be some videos and other stuff maybe popping up here. The next villain we're going to take a look at is from the starter set, and it is this handsome fella, the Black Spider. The Black Spider is a drow who's after the Forge of Spells in the Mines of Phandalin or Phandalv or whatever they're called. It's a villain the characters are probably gonna hear the name of already in the first session, but it's not a villain that we get a lot of expansion on. What is his motives? Who is he? He's not gonna show up and do anything beforehand, so the character's just gonna hear his name from time to time, and I found through the multiple times I've played through the starter set that's always pretty fun. But when you then get to the encounter with the Black Spider and it's just a drow wizard, challenge rating 2, you're level 5, he has 27 hit points, he's gonna go down to 1 smite from the paladin, more or less. It's not really, he doesn't live up to the sort of foreshadowing he's gotten, and he doesn't have that element where he sort of becomes personal with the party throughout, like haunts them or sends minions after them, stuff like that. So for these reasons, I think that the Black Spider is probably another... I'm sorry to have to put him down here with the D tier villains, because it has been, in my experience, in each time I've played through the adventure, sort of a letdown that you meet the Black Spider. It's just combat straight away, not a particularly exciting combat, and the Black Spider goes down very easily. So for these reasons, I think he winds up down here in the D tier. Next up, we have the villain from Rise of Tiamat and Horde of the Dragon Queen, and that is, of course, Tiamat herself, a challenge rating 30 dragon that the characters can meet at the very end of the adventure, and the adventure has of course been about Tiamat's minions and Tiamat and all that stuff. I think that it is the obvious villain for the adventure. It's a great villain for the adventure, and even though the combat at the end with Tiamat should be unwinnable, the writers have actually done a lot to make that combat realistic and also realistically winnable, because you can weaken the newly summoned form of Tiamat in various ways, and that is of course something that makes it sort of make sense that you can actually defeat her even if your character is only level 15. So I think that's really nice. I think it's a hard combat to run. It's not easy. It's not an easy encounter, and it will take some rather sturdy DMing to make as exciting as it should be. But if you manage it, having that final showdown with an actual dragon god is just incomparable to much else in D&D, and it's also the ending you want from an epic adventure that stretch across 15 levels of gameplay. I can't really put a finger on why I'm not going to put up at the S tier. I think it's probably because she's not directly foreshadowing a whole lot throughout the adventure, and also because that final combat is that difficult to run and can end up not being that entertaining if it goes poorly for you. And for those reasons, I think she's an A tier villain, not an S tier villain, but she is up there most definitely. The next villain we're going to take a look at is from Wild Beyond the Witchlight, and it is of course Icewilf or Tasha or whatever, Sibylna, one of her names you want to use. And she's not really a villain because you're in there to save her, but you can end up fighting her. It's sort of a weird adventure because who is really the villain of the adventure? It's probably the three hags, but I figured I'd put her here anyway. And I think that foreshadowing wise, it's done really well, where you've heard about Sibylna throughout the adventure. You may figure out who she really is, that she's Tasha or Icewilf or whatever. But when it comes down to actually encountering her, then of course the writers have done it so you don't necessarily need to encounter her, or you don't really need to fight her in any event, and you probably shouldn't either because she's a challenge rating 20 character. So I realized that it's maybe unfair to call her the villain, and that obviously affects her rating, but I do think that I can't give her higher than a B tier. That's maybe even too lenient. I think a C tier rating is probably more accurate here, simply because she isn't supposed to be fought, probably. Now I will say that if the characters could fight her or were meant to fight her and probably had a few more levels, then she does actually have a very entertaining stat block, because she has a lot of fun spells, she has some cool attacks and legendary actions, stuff like that, and she can also counterspell. She's quite entertaining as a character, but not in the adventure that she's put in. And that is one of the weaknesses, I think, with Wild Beyond the Witchlight, is that you don't really have that final villain you're gonna encounter. And if you're all right with that, all right with there not being a battle at the end of the adventure, which is the point, so I can't fault the writers for that. I just think it's not personally my style. I would have wanted that final showdown right there at the end, and I would have wanted that to be with Sibylna, or to have someone else be the clear villain. The next adventure we're going to take a look at is Out of the Abyss, and Out of the Abyss is also an adventure where we have a lot of different stuff going on, and in the end you're supposed to fight with Demogorgon near the town city of Menzoberranzan underneath in the Underdark, and it's sort of led up to as an epic encounter of sorts, but the adventure is so all over the place that you don't really get that connection to Demogorgon as the villain, at least not in my opinion. And I also think that the Demogorgon that we got in Out of the Abyss was really, really lackluster. It's not a very entertaining stat block. It's a high level, dangerous stat block, stuff like that, but it's not something that's gonna make for a memorable fight. And for those reasons, I think that Demogorgon is an E tier villain. It's simply not compelling for me, and I think that's a shame, because having demon lords roaming free and you have to fight one of them in the very end could make for such a compelling story, but there's just so much wrong with Out of the Abyss and the way everything's set up and the stat block for Demogorgon that is not going to play out that way. Next up, we're going to take a look at the Prince of the Apocalypse, which, just like Waterdeep Dragon Heist, has a lot of different villains. So I've just chosen a single image for them because I didn't really want to go through all of them. Basically, there's 4 sort of elemental minions for each of the 4 elements: air, earth, fire, water. And these 4 minions are challenge rating 8, and they can then summon some higher challenge rating, or around challenge rating 8, and they can summon some higher challenge rating elemental princes, so Okromok, Imix, Olhydra, and Yansi Bin, I think the last one is. My issue with those is that because, again, you have 4 villains, it's not entirely certain that you're gonna hear about all of the villains before you encounter them. You're not gonna encounter all of the villains. You're actually only going to encounter 1 or 2, and then you're gonna encounter 1 prince at the end. And I do think that some of the princes have interesting stat blocks that could be fun, but I also think that in most cases the combats with the minions at the very least are not going to be hugely interesting, and you won't have gotten that foreshadowing element you really need to make it super interesting. So for those reasons, I think that the villains from Prince of the Apocalypse are going to end up here at the D tier as a sort of general label for them. Next up, we're going to take a look at the villain from Baldur's Gate Descent into Avernus, and that is of course Zariel, the Fallen Angel. I think Zariel is probably one of the best foreshadowed villains in the entire catalog of D&D 5e villains, because you hear so much about Zariel from the very start of the adventure. As it is written, you don't even have to insert these things on your own. It is written in a way where you get a lot of information about Zariel. You get some visions where Zariel is included. You just have a lot of opportunity to learn about Zariel, and I think it makes her very, very compelling as a villain. She also has an interesting stat block, and the final encounter with her, while it may need some tweaking, really is very, very entertaining and can be a very compelling fight. So for those reasons, I think that Zariel is up here at the A and S tier. I'd probably put at A because there is some ways that the final encounter with her is not going to be that interesting in the end, and it can also be chaotic, and they didn't give you a map for it, something we provide in our DM's resource for Baldur's Gate Descent into Avernus, but we really wanted a map for that final encounter, a cool battle map that has some stuff going on, so you can, if of course you use maps. If you don't have to use a map, but I prefer to have a map for it, so I was kind of annoyed to see that they didn't give us that. For those reasons, I think that she's going to end up here in A, but she is very close to being an S tier villain in my opinion. And next up we have the villain from Dragon of Icespire Peak, which is Cryovane. It's just a young ice dragon, but it is the villain of the story. You're going to hear a lot about this dragon, and a lot of the stuff that's been going on in the region is caused by Cryovane, this dragon. And for those reasons, I think it's foreshadowed decently, but it is still just a white dragon, which are traditionally quite dumb, so it's not something that you actually interact with throughout the adventure. You're just gonna hear, okay, there's a dragon, and the dragon did this, the dragon did that, and then you meet the dragon, but you meet the dragon on sort of an empty roof space, and it's a young white dragon. It can really only attack and use breath attack. So for those reasons, as a villain, it's not really doing it for me. I think it's down here at the E tier, which is a bit of a shame, but then again, just like you have the Black Spider here, and these villains are maybe not the most compelling, it is a starter kit adventure. You probably want villains that are rather simple for the DM to play. You don't want it to be too complex. You don't want combats to be too complex. You're not gonna maybe give the dragon a super unique stat block with a lot of stuff going on. And for those reasons, I think it's okay. These villains aren't particularly the strongest, as these are definitely beginner adventures. Next up, we have the villain from Storm King's Thunder, and that is of course Iemrith. Iemrith is disguised as a giant throughout the adventure. She's actually behind the sundering of the Ordning. She's thrown all the giants into chaos. But the characters won't really know that until the very end. It's not something that they sort of figure out throughout the adventure. They just figure out that the Ordning is broken, stuff like that, and then they can figure out that she's behind it. But she's not that heavily tied into the story before the end, though her reveal is kind of cool. Her sort of persona is really cool, so I like that. There is also a scene where she shows up during the middle of the adventure, which is really cool because that foreshadows that, okay, there's this blue dragon involved and it's coming after us because we're trying to figure out what's going on. So I think that's also pretty cool. Now I would say that just like the young white dragon down here, a blue ancient dragon is not the most interesting monster. It doesn't have any spells, it's just a breath attack, it's frighten, it's claws and bite, and that's basically it. Which makes the final fight with Eventyr not that entertaining as written. Especially because the characters are gonna get a lot of help, but it's probably gonna make that fight kinda easy. At least as written. She's aided by gargoyles, which in their own right are also super bland creatures. So for me, I think that drags her down as a villain from a mechanical perspective, and she probably falls. I have a hard time figuring out if she's a B or C tier villain, but I think she's probably another C tier villain, where I think that's probably unfair to Auril to have her lumped in with these, so I think I'm gonna do it like this, because Auril is a step above these villains, I would say. The last villain we have is of course from Curse of Strahd, and he is probably one of the most noteworthy villains we've had in 5e Dungeons & Dragons, and it is of course Strahd von Zarovich. Now what makes Strahd von Zarovich a compelling villain is all the opportunities he has to interact with the characters before they have that final showdown with him, and it's also plausible why he has these interactions, why he sort of shows up to torment or tease or just observe the characters, interact with them. It's also something you will probably have to build on your own and have to do some stuff to make happen, but if you put in that effort, there's a lot of foreshadowing for Strahd. There's a lot of ways to really make him come alive and make it feel worthwhile when the characters do get to him. As a monster, he has a vampire stat block that is beefed up with spells and some different legendary actions, stuff like that, so he is quite compelling as a sort of boss monster, and I know there's also stuff you can do with the combat in the end to make that a bit more entertaining. You may need to beef him up a bit, but once again, Strahd von Zarovich, simply by merit of being the iconic vampire villain that has a lot of foreshadowing, that has a lot of interactions with the character, is a study in how you make a villain feel really, really compelling in 5e Dungeons & Dragons, and for that reason I think he deserves to be here up at the S tier along with Elixir. So yeah, this is my tier list for the D&D villains. I'm happy enough to see that there's no F tier villains down here. I think you'd have to do really poorly to become an F tier villain. Maybe I'm being too nice to a few of these. Demogorgon could probably be an F tier villain, but I think this is a fairly fair spread. I'd love to hear which of these villains is your favorite, and maybe what experience you had running these villains or playing against these villains if you were a player that really made them stand out for you and made sure that they were the most memorable villain of 5e Dungeons & Dragons. If you like the video, also please like and subscribe, and if you want to support what we do here, you can head on over to patreon.com/eventyr and become a patron, and patron of course also gets access to weekly encounters for 5e Dungeons & Dragons and a lot of other cool stuff, including the opportunity to vote on which videos we will be making. Beyond that, there's not a whole lot left to say, except thank you for watching, and I hope that I'll see you in the next video.